Hello and welcome to Talking Points. I'm Dave Kelly, Director of Advanced Media Production at Cal State Long Beach. Today we're going to talk about China's emerging leadership role on the world economic stage. My guest today is Dr. Jack Howe. Dr. Howe is a professor of economics, and he is also our resident expert on China and the international economy. Welcome, Jack. It's always good to have you back here.
Thank you. It's a pleasure coming back again.
Well, let's start by talking about the Chinese rate of growth. And those of us that have been following this for the last 15, 20 years know that there was a long stretch of time where China's GDP growth year over year was about 10% on average. But now in the last 2 or 3 years, that has come down significantly. Now it's between about 6.5% to 6.9%. And Chinese officials are saying this is the new normal for China. So why has it come down almost by a third, and why is this the new normal?
Well, first of all, the new normal is a terminology coined by the current leadership, Xi Jinping. I've always felt, even though he calls it new normal, he is actually very anxious of trying to break through the new normal. This is new normal, this terminology is a soothing attempt for the people. There are many reasons. Of course, the most obvious is in the past, a lot of the growth is what I call fluff with a little bit of water content. They overbuilt a lot of the infrastructure. By infrastructure, I don't mean roads. I mean apartments, office buildings, to show the local government showing their accomplishment. And that is tightly correlated with the corruption, and the current leadership has tried to significantly crack down on corruption, and he is no longer using the local GDP growth as a measure of success for the local governors. So with a crackdown on corruption, and my local GDP growth is no longer a measurement of my accomplishment, it is natural for the growth rate to slow down. The good news is China's growth rate now is probably more real than it was in the past. And also, I want to remind the audience, as China grows, if you look at it, growth rate is the increase in GDP over its current GDP. As its denominator keeps growing, of course, even with the same increase in GDP, percentage-wise, it's going to be smaller, much like a student. If he or she did not study for the midterm and only got 5 points, and the second midterm, he improved and got 10 points, that's a 100% improvement. But a student that got 90 points in the first midterm, improved to 95, the growth rate is much, much smaller.
We should also put this in perspective, because if we had 6.5% growth in the US, we would be overwhelmed, either here or in Europe, and it would probably overheat the economy, actually. So 6.5 is still a lot of growth, no matter how you look at it. And in terms of the corruption aspect of it, as you said, a lot of this growth, the 10% growth that we were talking about earlier, came about as a result of overbuilding and waste and corruption. So how are they going to be able to keep a lid on that corruption in China these days?
Well, they are attacking both the tigers and the flies. The flies mean the small, low-level government official, tigers, high-ranking. The numbers are staggering in terms of the number of arrests, and I don't see China slowing down. As for whether it will really root out corruption, I have somewhat of reservation. I always like to say, when you have anti-corruption, those that truly have the channel, they will still find a way. It, however, does create a lot of hardship for the law-binding officials and other civil servants. I don't think China can fully root out corruption. And another thing I'm concerned about is Xi Jinping is probably using anti-corruption as a way of consolidating his power and getting rid of potential threats or people that don't see eye to eye with him.
We're going to talk about Xi Jinping a little bit more in a moment, but first, as we stay on this theme of corruption, another aspect of this is what's referred to as the Chinese shadow banking system. And that involves a number of loans and financial products that are being generated in China that are not regulated by the government. They call them trust loans in some cases. They also have what are called negotiable certificates of deposit, and also wealth management products that involve making loans that are not under government scrutiny. They're trying to crack down on that, but it's a big problem. And where is that money coming from, and why has it become such a big problem?
Well, the money comes from predominantly domestically in China, but it also has attracted hot money from overseas. Overseas, mostly probably overseas Chinese. I have friends that have actually taken their money out of US banks and put it in these shadow bank operations in China where they can earn 10, 15% return compared to our 0.5% CD rate. So that's why it's very attractive. My personal belief is, I'm not a total expert on this, but my personal belief is the root cause of this is the high saving rate in China and the relatively narrow investment channel. So a lot of the pent-up savings, monetary overhang, if you want to call it, have no, I wouldn't say legitimate, but not good enough return for their investment, and that's why we see a lot of this. And as the government tries to tighten the control of money supply, a lot of business, especially private business, lack the ability of going through official channels to get the financing and loans they need, and they resort to what paramounts to loan sharking.
One of the experts that has looked into this has said in China it's like a cat and mouse game between those that lend and the regulators, and the phrase that he said was, when one credit door closes in China, another one opens up. So that's the problem, I guess.
Yes, and that is, we can also broaden that to the corruption. If you crack down on one corrupt official, and probably two will take his place, much like Hercules trying to slay the nine-headed serpent.
Okay, well, let's move on to President Xi Jinping and the fact that people are calling him now the strongest leader in China in decades. And is that the case? Is he the strongest leader China's had for quite a while? And if so, is that a good thing or a bad thing for China and the rest of the world?
There is no doubt that Xi Jinping is the strongest leader in, say, in the last 3 or 4 Chinese leadership. As for whether this is a good or bad thing, it's hard to tell. I personally lean towards a bad thing. Being a strong leadership, of course, that allows him to carry out the anti-corruption, implement a lot of the economic policies that will have long-term effects on China. What is concerning is he's consolidating not just his political power, but also the economic power. What in the economic arena we have been saying in the last decade or so, actually before Xi Jinping came to power, is that the government is becoming richer while the people is becoming poorer, meaning the state-owned enterprise are rolling in cash, rolling in profit, while the little business have difficulty obtaining loans and staying alive. And my personal concern is more on the political side. China had a, what I feel, rather ingenious and wonderful system. In other words, leader one, generation one, does not appoint the leader does not appoint his successor. He actually appoints the successor of his successor. So you skip a generation rather than a direct line of succession. So this prevents a dictatorship, so to speak. But Xi Jinping recently arrested the next generation successor that was appointed by his predecessor. With this person gone, Xi Jinping now can appoint his successor. And that is troubling.
And that's a consolidation of the control that you were
Yes.
talking about. Well, let's move on and talk about the initiative, the very large initiative that Xi Jinping announced in 2013, and that's the One Belt, One Road massive infrastructure project for all of Asia. And we have a couple of maps here that we want to show the audience. The first map shows those different routes that are going to be developed as a part of this One Belt, One Road strategy. You see we have a northern route, which basically goes from China through northern China, Mongolia, across Russia, all the way over to where Finland is. We have a second route that goes from central China across through Kazakhstan, southern Russia, all the way into the heart of Europe. We have a couple of other routes, one that goes through the Middle East, through Iran and Turkey on the way to southern Europe. We have one that goes through Pakistan all the way to the port of Gwadar. We have two more routes in Southeast Asia, and then finally the maritime route, which takes us around Southeast Asia, around India, around the Middle East, and down into Africa. And one more thing, Jack, before I give you a chance to comment, we have another map, the second map that we're going to take a look at here, which shows what a Chinese sailor, the most famous sailor in Chinese history, the captain of the Chinese Navy in the 1400s, his sailing was from China all the way around Southeast Asia, around India, the Middle East, and down into Africa. So just for a moment, because we're starting to run out of time before the break here, Jack, 1400s, 600 years ago, the Chinese were already sailing the ocean blue 70 years before Columbus did it in 1492. So what was Zhenghe all about in those days?
Well, Admiral Tang, he had 7 expeditions to explore the world. And as you can see from the map, the Silk Road, the new maritime Silk Road, does mimic his routes. And I want to take this opportunity and sort of discuss. A lot of contemporaries are worried that China is trying to overexpand its military might. And I want to clarify, in my personal view, China has never been a real expansionist in terms of its ideology. If you look at Admiral Tang, his 7 expeditions, he had a troop of close to 28,000. And he had I think 62 treasure boats. Clarify, the treasure boats are not looting treasure. These are treasure boats that brings treasure as gifts to the various kingdoms they visit. So it's not a conquering mission. And the 62 treasure ships measure 127 meters long, 52 meters wide. Remember, that is almost 1.5 football fields in length. And that is supported by another 190 smaller ships. So you can see the armada. At that time, China was by far the largest maritime. But it was mainly a diplomatic mission and not a conquering mission. There have been rumors that he was there searching for the deposed emperor, where his master overthrew, and the loyalists smuggled him allegedly to Southeast Asia. So there were rumors that he was looking for that, but that is just rumors.
Okay, Jack, we're going to have to go to the break right now, but when we pick this up after the break, we're going to talk about the One Belt, One Road strategy, and if this is going to work out the way it's intended to work out, or if it might be, in an infrastructure term, a bridge too far. Stay with us.
Should your company buy or sell, expand or not, relocate, or simply stay the same? If you'd like to examine past and present predictions, integrating finances and people, and make future predictions based on all that information, a career in economics is for you. You can become a part of this exciting field with a degree from Cal State Long Beach.
Welcome back to Talking Points. I'm Dave Kelly, and my guest today is Dr. Jack Howe, and we're talking about the Chinese economy and the plan known as One Belt, One Road. And before we went to the break, we were talking about the Chinese Navy in the early 1400s and how they were the dominant military sea power at that time, but they didn't really utilize that for military purposes per se. And so today, when people talk about the One Belt, One Road strategy that China is coming up with enabling all of this infrastructure to be built across Asia. It's not so much about military occupation, if you want to call it that. It's much more about economic development. So let's pick up on that theme for a moment. What is China trying to accomplish with all of this infrastructure development across Asia?
David, you are exactly right. It's mainly economic in focus, has nothing to do with military. It does touch on politics. When China suffered, like the rest of the world, with the subprime crisis, the first wave of China's strategy was to increase domestic absorption. And that means increasing domestic consumption, hoping that will bring up GDP. And it was not successful. And then they talked about infrastructure upgrading, but that is easier said than done. So the One Belt, One Road is really their third attempt at breaking the new normal. As I stated earlier, even though they call it new normal, they don't view it as normal at all. They are anxious and nervous trying to break through the current growth rate, even though, as you said, if the US or EU enjoyed that growth rate, we would be dancing in the streets. So it's mostly economical, and as Xi Jinping said, this strategy is not just for the prosperity of current China, but for generations of Chinese to come. So it is a long-term objective. I've written papers saying I greatly admire this initiative. If you look at it, I think I coined the phrase, if they are successful, it will be comparable to the Industrial Revolution, its impact on the human race. Because depending on what version you're looking at, the One Belt, One Road covers 65 countries, roughly 65% of the world population. Yet, this 65% of the world population only account for 29% of the world GDP. In other words, roughly saying they are below average. So if we can bring this 65% of the population just up to middle income countries, that would be a tremendous benefit to the whole world. As for whether it's doable, I have my reservations. As you mentioned, a bridge too far. I mentioned in quite a few of my seminars, it is water too far. There is an old saying in China, water that is far away cannot put out the fire next door. China is trying to break the new normal, yet the One Belt, One Road will take, in my estimate, at least a decade, if not two, to really have significant impact. So it is bridge too far, it is water too far.
All right, so if we take a look at this from the cynics' point of view, a lot of the cynics are saying, well, this is really just a chance for China to enhance the revenues for their engineering firms and for their technology firms, and to allow the Chinese companies to gain access to the world stage in the way that our companies here, like Bechtel and Halliburton and the Fluor Corporation and so on, did in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s and so forth. What do you think of that?
There is obvious some truth to it. China has the capacity of engineering all of these. Remember, their railroad that connects from Beijing to Tibet, most Westerners didn't think that was doable. They accomplished that. It is by far the highest elevation of any railroad in the world. But I sincerely hope the Chinese are much, much more open in terms of the development of this. Remember, China has been highly critical of the operation of the World Bank and IMF, and that is why in the last couple of years, 5, 6, 7 years, China has worked hard to bring about the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, headquartered in Beijing, and the new development bank, which was originally called Bank of the BRICS, headquartered in Shanghai. This is trying to break through the stranglehold of EU and the US, their control of IMF and World Bank. What I have often stated if China is sincere of creating a new, more equal platform, China needs to invite the members of the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank members and the new development bank members to participate in the One Belt, One Road. Because remember, as we mentioned in the map, the northern part is highly correlated with Russia, and Russia is an integral member of the new development bank. If you look at the maritime road, it goes through India, and India is the new development bank. And if you look at the maritime road, it also touches East Africa, where South Africa can clearly play a pivotal role. And if you look at the Indochina route and the other Bangladesh, China, India, Myanmar economic corridor, these all need to have mobilization of the AIIB members. And I firmly believe China should also sincerely invite the US and EU to participate in this, if they are sincere in terms of their original criticism of the operation of the IMF and World Bank. And in that sense, if China can do that, it will bring prosperity to all.
We're going to talk about the relationship between China and the US in a moment, but first let's talk a little bit about the development of those South China Sea islands, which has caused a lot of controversy in the last few years. Why is China so intent on developing those South China Sea islands? And then we'll talk about North Korea, but let's start with the South China Sea.
Well, if you look at the South China Sea, since well before Communist China, the Chinese government under Chiang Kai-shek controlled over 150 small islands in that region. Now they only control a handful, so it's much, much less than it was before. But that's historical terms. If you look at the intention, two things. First of all, there's a lot of potential in terms of oil and natural gas under that region. So there's energy-wise, that is potentially a very, very important deposit. And let's not forget, South China Sea is where China will start its maritime Silk Road. So I don't see China backing down from that aspect.
All right, well, let's move north to North Korea and the obvious ongoing conflict we have there. China supplies North Korea with 90% of its trade. So basically, North Korea is a creation of China, essentially. And so China built this situation, and they've taken advantage of it over the years. Where are we headed with this situation involving North Korea?
There is no doubt that China created North Korea. Since the current administration's grandfather, if it wasn't for the strong support of China, they would have never succeeded in establishing North Korea. And if you look at it, there are several reasons China is reluctant to intervene in North Korea the way the US would like. Couple of things. From a military point of view, it creates several hundred miles of buffer. So from a national defense point of view, that is important. And also, North Korea is China's creation, and it is becoming, I don't know how big a nightmare is, but it certainly is a migraine, a headache for China. I often remind and talk with my Chinese friends, North Korea's missile may not accurately reach Los Angeles, but it can definitely reach Beijing. And let's not forget, just a nuclear accident will cause a large chunk of fertile land of northeast China becoming wasteland for centuries. Chinese are concerned for several things. They don't want to lose face of intervening North Korea at the request of the US, because it's going to look bad for them politically, meaning that they are becoming a subordinate, so to speak. And also, the Chinese are legitimately concerned if the North Korea economy collapses, the administration topples, there will be a huge refugee crisis.
So they have a lot of concerns. We just have a minute or so left, Jack, so I want to bring in the U.S. component to this relationship. You've already touched on that, but as far as the U.S. and Chinese relationship is concerned, going forward, the initial meeting that Xi Jinping and Donald Trump had in Florida went well, better than people had expected. They seemed to bond at Mar-a-Lago. And so does this bode well for the future, or was this just a marriage of convenience?
I think both. President Trump did a lot of posturing, and the Chinese were quite nervous. So Xi Jinping was pleasantly surprised, to say the least. And President Trump is still showing the characteristic of a business negotiation. So I'm going out on the limb a little bit. I can see Xi Jinping and Trump sort of a business dealing in exchange for China's more heavy-handed action in North Korea. The U.S. might back off of South China Sea and potentially even in the Taiwan issue. And that, of course, I'm from Taiwan, so that is something that is of concern to me personally. But I do see it is, in China, I've always said, we should look at Donald Trump not just as the President of the United States, but the CEO of the large company called the United States of America.
All right, we have about 20 seconds left, Jack. In 20 seconds or less, and I know that's very limiting, Asian culture, Chinese values, and so on, are they going to be able to use the economic leadership to help promote their own value system in the way that Hollywood has always promoted American values? Is that going to happen?
No doubt, no doubt. China is approaching that in two ways. From a political sense, there is a Confucius Institute, which is actually an arm of the government that is investing money, building cultural centers worldwide. They are exporting Chinese culture and value. And as China business expands throughout the world, you see an increased presence of Chinese businessmen, and that will bring Chinese restaurants, Chinese culture, Chinese bookstores, and such. And there is no doubt in my mind, China is explicitly doing this.
Thank you, Jack. We've run out of time. It's always great to talk to you. Maybe we'll have you again another day.
My pleasure, my pleasure.
And thank you for joining us on this edition of Talking Points. Join us again soon for the next episode. Until then, I'm Dave Kelly. Have a nice day.